Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, brought to you and presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I introduce to you Brother Chris Ludke.
This is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore Masonry under the Reich, Part 3, The Craft Occupied. Yes, we're into Part 3 of the series, looking at Masonry under the Reich, breaking all of the rules of the Further Light podcast. Because whereas every other episode is 15 minutes, occasionally 30 minutes if needed, I blew that out of the water with the last episode on slightly over an hour. Sometimes these things happen. History's complicated. History's very muddy. And in this case, we're looking at Masonry under the Reich during the war, so roughly 1939 through 45. And this was supposed to be a single episode. But, as has happened throughout this series, it got split. So here we're going to deal with issues such as the Masonic amnesty that we're going to see in Germany, what happens to Masons throughout the rest of Europe, the Anti-Masonic Exhibition and other items. And then the next episode, Part 4, will be Masonry in the camps, looking at the Masonic experience in POW camps as well as in general political prisoner camps, night and fog camps, but we'll get to that. And as we move through this, a couple of things that I want to address. First of all, yes, I'm taking a lot of my inspiration for this from Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, although I'm not doing a 4-hour episode. Close, I probably could. But he's a fantastic public-facing historian, great social historian, so absolutely I want to use that. And then I'm using material that I've picked up from Dr. Irene Gunther, one of my professors at Marquette in my master's program. She was an absolute expert on people in the Nazi era, how people felt about things, what was the day-to-day experience. And of course, I've had a lot of brothers I've spoken to throughout. I've got brothers who help with the podcast, brothers who I generally consult when I come across things. So there's been a lot of inspiration here. But war is chaotic. It leads to some odd choices, depending on your perspective. And remember, perspective changes. Historically, perspective changes. Of course, looking back, we have 20/20 vision. You've heard that a lot. Hindsight is 20/20. But when you're there, when there's a Gestapo agent at your door or the threat of someone coming to your door, you're going to make certain decisions. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a number of Masons in Germany at the time who are going to actively support the Nazis. Just like you see people today actively supporting different political parties. It's really no different. And at the time, throughout the Weimar Republic, from World War I all the way up to 39, really up to 33, we had seen that swing back and forth between the extreme left, the communists, the Bolsheviks, the extreme right, the authoritarians, eventually the fascists. And so to the German people in the election, the Nazis were the lesser of several evils. They said they would bring peace. And they kind of did if you were the right kind of German. If you weren't, however, it was a problem. Now today we are dealing with a number of things: the amnesty, Masonry Unconquered Europe, and the Anti-Masonic Exhibitions. I'm going to be taking a thematic approach in this episode, so we're not doing chronological order. I did that in the last episode because so much was going on and so much was building on other things that we kind of needed to do that. I see no problem in swapping back and forth between organizational schemes when needed. Ultimately, I want clarity to be the overarching factor here, not some wonderful artistic or aesthetic choice when it comes to history. And my sources are very similar. So we're dealing with Bennett and his thesis. We're dealing with Thomas and his dissertation, Brother Allen, Stalag Masons, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, The Reich at War by Sir Richard Evans, The Berlin Diary by William Shirer. And we're going to start getting into Gilles MacDonald, who's looking at After the Reich, the denazification. That's going to start sneaking in. And we're going to see some other ideas coming in. Mueller on trauma and memory and how that all works. And others who are going to come up, but these are the main sources that I'm using. And let me point out what's happening in World War II. Enter stage, September 1, 1939. The Germans will invade Poland. Shortly thereafter, the Russians will go ahead and invade the other half. The Germans and the Russians sign a non-aggression pact that isn't worth the paper it's printed on, and it lasts less than 18 months. Maybe less than 24 months. If you are German, you've been through these situations where they have drives for specific materials, because Germany is a small country. Not a big population compared to all of the allies against them. And so when we look at Germany, they're already suffering hardship in 39 and 40. They're already giving things up. They're rationing because they need more U-boats. They need more aircraft. Because as soon as war starts, you start burning through materials. And you can't just pick up an aircraft in the field where it's crashed, recycle it into another Me-109. It doesn't work that way. And so things are already tough. Add to that the German experience in World War II, which is 20 years before, and that's important. The reason World War II can't happen until 1939 is Germany doesn't have the population. In 1918, as I've touched on, depending on whose numbers you read, between 20 and 40% of the entire male population is a casualty of war. And so it takes 20 years from 1918 until 1938-39 for new children to be born, to be put into the meat grinder. The meat grinder that is war. And one other thing to keep in mind, World War II, unlike World War I, is not soldier on soldier. It is soldier on civilian. Sure, 26 million, whoever you read, whoever you listen to, soldiers die in World War II, but well over 50 million civilians die. You have the advent of firebombing, you have the advent of aerial bombardment, you have all sorts of things going on. So with all that in mind, let's get into Masonry under the Reich, Part 3, The Craft Occupied. We're going to start with the amnesty. The lodges, such as they were left with no alternative but to close. Of course, they had done this years before. However, while the party rejected Freemasonry as an organization, the door was still open to individuals. And this is a strange situation that the Freemasons find themselves in. Because unlike the Jews or the Gypsies or the physically disabled or so many other groups where you couldn't walk away from that, you could theoretically walk away from Freemasonry. It was an optional group, whereas you were born Jewish from the German perspective. So they find themselves in very difficult territory, the Germans in this case. The new problem, at least for the party, was striking the right balance between ideological purity and practical necessity, letting Freemasons work with the regime without appearing to sacrifice party integrity. While the Freemasons maintained that name changes and reorganization was done in the name of genuine nationalist support, the regime remained understandably skeptical. They are concerned that the Freemasons are going to rise up as one, something as if out of the legend of the Peasants' Revolt or the Pheasants' Revolt. That would have been more impressive, all these birds rising up across England in the 14th century, but moving on. They're concerned that the Freemasons, being a secret organization, could spread ideas, could work with the resistance. You never know. Thus, when scores of former Freemasons sought admission into the party and its auxiliaries, the Nazis stood at a bit of an impasse. On one hand, these men were educated professionals whose skills were essential to the success of the regime. On the other hand, these men belonged to an organization that, according to the party, fostered internationalism and was manipulated by the Jews. You see the problem. Most former lodge members seeking entrance had most likely joined Freemasonry in the first place, according to Thomas, for social and professional reasons. But the example of Leo Muffelman demonstrated that some in the lodges truly believed in the ideology, and while the regime could make allowances for the former, it dreaded accidentally letting in someone like Muffelman, someone who truly believed in the Masonic teachings who would begin to undermine the Reich from within. For example, the SD had a letter from the former Totenkampf and Phoenix Lodge to one of its members, stating, quote, "We have gathered here in new form, but in old spirit. We have closed down, but at the same time, we haven't." This letter continued to explain how words and terms may have changed, but the laws and principles behind the terms remained. Such correspondence had led to the rejection of the Christian orders and the dissolution of Freemasonry. But while the regime had given its final answer to the lodges as an institution, the matter of individual Masons posed a different problem. If they ban all former Freemasons, that would seem to be a foolish decision. Because Germany lacks manpower, they need educated men, they need capable men. Here's a whole group that you're eliminating. But there still had to be some kind of straining process to weed out Freemasons who, the Nazi Party was so certain, would try to join the party with the intention of either destroying it from within or acting to help other, quote, questionable Freemasons in as well. The party ultimately needed a happy medium, but the problem came in trying to codify what separated, quote, true Freemasons, the likes of Muffelman, the Symbolic Lodge, etc., from the social joiners. And this is a big argument that Thomas makes in his dissertation about why Masons join and what's driving them to join the Nazi Party. As I discussed in the last episode, there's a lot of possibilities here. So over the course of the Third Reich, the policies regarding former Freemasons in the party civil service and the government followed a roller coaster of a career. In 1933, we saw Freemasons banned from the party and government. By 1939, Hitler granted an amnesty that was already pretty much a fait accompli. Basically saying, if you're a Freemason, we're not really that concerned. We might keep an eye on you. Please go fight on the behalf of Germany. And I should say, they're not trying to get soldiers. Officers, maybe. But most of the Masons they're going after are similar to Masons today. They're in their 30s, 40s, 50s. These are not the guys you want to put on the front line with a gun. They're certainly not going to move as quickly as the 18-year-olds are up against. But they can run the factories. They can make sure that armaments are moving properly. They can run logistics. They have knowledge. And keep in mind, the infantry isn't all that we have in an army. So the main reason for the compromise was that former Freemasons were simply too valuable to reject because of some old association. By the time this is happening in 1939, that old association has been dissolved for 4, 5, 6 years. So they're arguing that, hey, things have changed. Even the SS acknowledged several times that the policy of removing Freemasons was not only impractical, but also arguably unnecessary. Furthermore, Freemasons have been pushed for years to work with the party, regardless of the fate of the lodges and the Christian orders. Given the socioeconomic position of these men, it makes sense. If you're some of the most skilled, you're the lawyers, you're the doctors, you're the first people the party wants in. So there's pressure from family, whether they're actually applying it or not, or you're applying it to yourself to survive. There's pressure from the party to come and join them because you have valuable skills. You have all these different pressures going on. You want to be a good German. So what are you going to do? With the threat of war looming at the beginning of 1939, the RSHA office in charge of Freemasonry reported, quote, "Many Freemasons are worried that in case of war, all Freemasons will be put into camps to halt their corruptive influence." And that's a very reasonable concern. After all, they've seen all these other people put into the camps. Many of them went to the camps for periods of time. Let's not forget Mufflemen and members of the Scottish Rite, members of other Grand Lodges. The Reich Security Main Office, or RSHA, was an organization subordinate to Heinrich Himmler in his dual capacity as chief of German police and the head of the Nazi Party's SS. The organization's stated duty was to fight all enemies of the Reich, inside and outside the borders of Germany, which would have included the Freemasons. They fear that they won't be able to show their patriotism and point out that many former communists and center folk being people like Social Democrats, etc., now proudly wear the party badge. And of course, when you're surrounded by people, you see your people lose, and you're surrounded by people who are victorious. You're surrounded by people who are what they would have seen at the time, maybe, as they're on the right side of history. You're going to be pushed towards that idea of changing allegiances. But at the same time, whereas these former communists and centerfolk could join the party, the majority of Freemasons were not permitted the same opportunity. By looking at the way in which the party tried to decide where to draw the line, we can see the party's struggle. At first, all Freemasons are banned. But then men like Walter Buch, head of the Supreme Party Court, that People's Court that we've talked about dealing with moral issues within the party, argued that a blanket policy was excessive, suggesting instead separating Old Prussian from humanitarian. When we look at a letter from another gentleman, Grand Master of Masons in Hamburg, and he will send a personal letter to Hitler applauding his efforts and claiming that many of the men of his lodge at the time were sympathetic to the Nazi cause. This is all happening in August of 31, but Broz, this old Grand Master, writes a letter showing that there were Nazi-minded men in the humanitarian lodges. And division by branch was insufficient. You couldn't say, well, we'll accept the Prussian brothers, but not the humanitarian brothers. Next, the line is drawn according to when someone left the lodge, arguing that those that left before the seizure of power did so honestly, while those who did so afterwards were hurriedly trying to put as much distance between them and the lodge as possible, knowing what the Nazis thought of Freemasonry. In 1935, the party added the restriction limiting exceptions to those of the third degree or lower. Again, this misunderstanding of the degree system in Freemasonry, this idea that if you go to Scottish Rite, somehow you're a more powerful Mason, you're a better Mason, or something along those lines. And of course, we know that's not exactly the case. Finally, Hitler will declare an amnesty in 1938. And again, like all of these issues, it's a muddy issue. There's really a single date. There are a number of different amnesties that come out. At every step along the way, we see exceptions permitted, accompanied with each new policy paving the way for the next policy shift. With little restrictions remained, what little restrictions remained, in other words, brothers who are barred from office, for example, were enforced so sporadically that enforcement isn't even really a functional word in this case. Those in charge of carrying out the policy recognize the value of keeping the men, even if they have belonged to a Masonic lodge, and either refuse to carry out the order or campaign vigorously to keep the man in his office, because many of these men were chosen as Masons or became Masons for a reason. They were probably well-known politicians, civil servants, etc., doctors, lawyers, as we've said. And these are not the kind of men that we want to push out. And so they constantly make exceptions. And of course, the Masons have social connections to many of these people, so they can draw on that. Hey, I happen to know your brother. Let's talk. So the amnesty is very interesting. It only happens in Germany. It doesn't happen in the rest of Europe. But does happen, allowing the Masons to take part on the National Socialist side in the war. Now, I should say, not every Mason will collaborate with the Nazis, but at the same time, if they're anything like the rest of the German population, a great many of them will join the Nazi Party really as an act of survival, more than as an act of belief. That being said, there would have been plenty of Masons who believed in the National Socialist ideals. The vision that they had for the world. They would have sat there and gone, look, they fixed the economy after the Great Depression. They're making German people proud of who they are, which we haven't been since World War I. They're doing these things that are arguably very positive. So maybe we join. Maybe it's survival. Maybe it's a belief in parts of the ideology. It's complicated. It's muddy. And that's why I'm taking so much time with it. Because to avoid that is to do the German Freemasons an injustice. So let's look at Masonry at war in Europe. What's going on in the European theater? By the way, I could do this with the Pacific theater as well, but it wouldn't make a lot of sense when we're dealing with the Reich. That will probably be another episode down the line. And when I say one episode, I probably mean 8 or whatever ridiculous number I come up with. So as the Germans conquer Europe, they forcibly dissolve Masonic organizations and confiscated their assets and documents wherever they establish an occupation regime. The first thing they do in any area that they take over is find the Masonic lodges, take the records, and those go to an archive. And then you had better believe they're visiting those brothers. Some of these lodges will burn the materials. Unfortunately, the Grand Lodges don't always follow up. Which means, while the local lodge may have burned the material, the Grand Lodge may still have it, and other officers working on behalf of the Grand Lodge might have access to parts or all of the material. They can piece this all together. After a lodge is closed, it's going to be ransacked, looking for membership lists, important library and archival items. There's going to be an intellectual war against the Masons I'll touch on later. They're going to take furnishings and other cultural artifacts. Items seized would be sent on to the appropriate German agency, primarily the SD, and later the RSHA. Some of Germany's Axis partners decreed police and discriminatory measures against Masons. And so we're going to see a lot of anti-Masonic ideals sweeping across Europe along with the Germans. I want to look at some examples from Europe. We'll start with Austria. Between 1934 and 1936, a majority of the Masonic lodges in Austria will be closed. By 1938, the Nazis acquired the Grand Lodge of Vienna and arrested the Grand Master, Dr. Richard Schlesinger. He will die shortly after arrest from the harsh treatment he receives at the hands of his captors. Remember, Grand Masters at the time are not young men. It's no different than today. Many of them are retirees or older gentlemen, people who have made their lives in business or wherever else. And so they're going to be treated harshly. They're going to suffer much more than a young man would, and this is going to raise many of the issues. But we have further stories. Let's move to the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, their Grand Master, Hermanus van Tongeren, which I may be mispronouncing, and I apologize, it's Tongeren, refused to cooperate with the Nazis and would be arrested in October of 1940. So the Nazis had already occupied the Netherlands. They had invaded the Netherlands in the spring of 1940 and swept across to Paris. This was part of their grand scheme, moving through the lowlands. By the way, pretty much exactly what they did in World War I, but no one really believed they'd do it again. And so they're coming through after. They've conquered the French, they've conquered everyone else. Now they're doing a sweep up. So the Grand Master is going to be arrested in October of 1940. He was held for 6 months in Amsterdam before being transferred to Sachsenhausen, where he dies in March of 1941. When he had been offered safe passage to England by his captors, he said, "I've enjoyed the pleasures of being Grand Master. Now I must also carry the burden." And this is coming from the Allen article called Stalag Freemasonry. I should represent that a little bit. He's offered safe passage before he's arrested, and he declines. In 1939, Masonic membership in the Netherlands will exceed 6,000. By 1945, we're only aware of 2,000 Masons left alive. 2/3 will be killed. When you get outside of Germany, the Masons don't have the time to chase after amnesties and negotiate and come from a position of power. They're not in a position of power. They're being occupied. And so the Germans will imprison them. They'll send them to slave camps. And eventually, in many cases, they will kill them. And just think about that for a minute. Think about the risk. It's one thing to be a sideline member of Masonry, but in these cases, these are Grand Lodge officers, people who took on a role that they saw as a great honor. The irony being, because of that great honor, they are the first on the list. They're the first up against the wall. And so they are in a dangerous position. As I said, in some cases, they try and burn records and destroy archives, but sometimes it doesn't work. Especially in the age of paper archives, things exist all over the place. Just imagine today, if the same thing were to happen, for almost all of us, we would get a knock on the door. Because there's nowhere central that you can destroy the records. Your lodge has them. They have records, they have minutes, they have information, they have petitions. The Grand Lodge has it, probably in some electronic form. There might even be a company in, say, New York that has all of the information available to them, and you have no control over any of it. And so what do? Do you run? Do you send away family and hope for the best? Do you accept your fate? Let's talk about Belgium. In Belgium, a movement called the Purification assisted in liquidating Freemasonry in the country. The purification is this very interesting idea. It's a group of people who have a great hatred of Freemasonry. I might do something on that in the future, but we're not going to dig into that right now. The Nazis ordered all lodges dissolved in August of 1941. So actually they gave Belgian Masons a little bit of time. They've invaded and they've held Belgium at this point for over a year. And the Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite, a man by the name of Georges Péter, and other high Masonic officials would be shot in their homes between December of 1942 and February of 1943. In some cases, their families will be killed with them. When we talk about the persecution of Freemasonry under the Reich, we are frequently talking about the persecution of Freemasonry under German occupation. Not necessarily in Germany. Some will be killed. Some will be imprisoned in Germany. Outside of Germany, however, your odds are much higher that you're going to be imprisoned, killed, or otherwise sent away. The whole of the Scottish Rite Library in Belgium will be sent to Berlin as part of the intellectual war. Approximately 80 Belgian Masons appear to have died in concentration camps, possibly more, because many are sent for other reasons. Maybe they're political prisoners, which is never a good thing to be if you're up against the Nazis. Maybe they're sent as members of the resistance. Maybe they're sent for publishing materials that are inappropriate from a Nazi worldview. So there's a lot of reasons people are sent, and it's not always obvious that they are Freemasons. We're going to get to that a little bit later in the camps in the next episode. France is a whole different ball of wax. In August of 1940, the Vichy French regime, now the Vichy French government is basically the collaborating government. France falls to the Germans. They put into place a government that collaborates with the Germans known as Vichy. They're basically an extension of the Nazis in Germany. And they issued a decree declaring Masons to be enemies of the state and authorizing police surveillance of them. The French wartime authorities even created a card file that identified every member of the Grand Orient of France, a leading French organization, Masonic organization, basically the French Grand Lodge. Their headquarters would be sealed with a death penalty for anyone who entered. Individual Masons had their residences searched, and they were banned from positions of command, and often put out of their businesses and professions. Imagine, suddenly the winds turn, the invasion works, and you're in France, you haven't done anything, and you get a knock on the door. And you suddenly find out that you have no income or lodge, and that you are now a persecuted class. And the next knock at the door could be the one that signals your own death. What do you do? Do you run? Do you hide? What do you do with your family? What do you do with the other brothers? Do you risk checking in? Because that could make you high profile. You might suddenly be arrested for that. Bernard Fay, who had written Revolution and Freemasonry, which was an anti-Masonic book before the war, was put in charge of anti-Masonic activities by the Vichy government. He caused the arrest of thousands of Freemasons, the deportation of almost 1,000, the death of another 1,000, the seizure of a great deal of property. Especially in France, those who collaborated with the Vichy regime participated in anti-Masonic propaganda. It's one of those things that's spread by the Nazis as they move into occupied territory. One such collaborator, the film producer and writer Jean Mamet, was actually an ex-Mason himself who had dissociated from Freemasonry in 1939. In 1943, Mamet, under the pseudonym Paul Richer, directed the anti-Masonic propaganda film Occult Forces, which tells the story of a French deputy who was initiated into Masonry to further his career, only to discover a sinister Jewish Masonic conspiracy that brought about the war. Meme will be executed for collaboration in 1949. That's coming from Patrick in History from the Scottish Rite, November-December 2018 edition. So what did they know in the United States of all of this at the time? Obviously, we know more now. It's also interesting to note what was known in international Masonic circles about the events in Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe. It is clear from the transactions of the Supreme Council of the Southern Jurisdiction, together with its magazine, The New Age, that American Masons were fully aware of the persecution being suffered by Jews and Freemasons alike in Germany and across Europe. William Fox notes that it was even clear to some long before the 1940 presidential election. The American Masons are aware of it, but they're in a tricky situation. How do you deal with that? How do you send any kind of help to a persecuted people? This litany of atrocity goes on ad nauseum throughout all of occupied Europe. A story of the Grand Lodge officers being tortured to reveal lists of Masons, Masonic property being confiscated, and brethren sent to concentration camps. And again, concentration camps are not the same as death camps. Concentration camps are often the work camps. But, leaving that aside, the amazing thing that comes out of this Holocaust is the number of Grand Lodge officers who actually resisted torture, even though they were advanced in years, and the fact that Masonic activity was even conducted within the concentration camps, a subject I will get to later. And it's not just Grand Lodge. Those are the ones we tend to hear about. Those are the ones they tend to write about. But there were plenty of worshipful masters and secretaries who were out there risking their lives to destroy records, to keep things away from the Nazis, to try and hide membership of their lodges. This is the part of the history where you should feel proud. Nor did the anti-Masonic fervor diminish during the war. When a German field marshal by the name of Paulus surrenders to the Soviet Union in 1943, he is denounced as being a high-grade Freemason. Despite the prohibition on Masons being in the armed forces, they use it as an excuse. Oh, this very important person was captured. It's got to be because he was a Mason. Can't be because there was a problem with a Nazi. So let's talk about the intellectual war. In 1940, a man by the name of Alfred Rosenberg will be made head of literally the high school, this German phrase referring to a college, the Center of National Socialist Ideological and Educational Research, out of which we see the Einsatzstab Reich Slettler Rosenberg, I will refer to this as the ERR, task force, will develop for the purpose of looting art and cultural goods, including Masonic artifacts. A letter to Rosenberg in 1940 recounts the confiscation in the Netherlands of 470 crates worth of material, including hundreds of thousands of Masonic books. By 1941, the ERR held over 500,000 Masonic volumes, not to mention archival documents. In 1942, Rosenberg was authorized by Hitler to wage an intellectual war against the Jews, and you guessed it, the Freemasons. To that end, Hitler permits Rosenberg's ERR to seize and evaluate Masonic archives and libraries to best equip them to carry on the, quote, methodical intellectual fight that was necessary to win the war. The members of the ERR were guaranteed the support of high command of the German armed forces in fulfilling their mission. The result was a series of articles by party professors such as Dr. Gunther Franz, who publishes a history of Freemasonry attacking Masonic history books as celebratory and wholly subjective. In place of party hacks like Rosenberg, senile old men like Ludendorff, and overzealous party members, the new research was based on the documents confiscated in the early years of the regime and written by scholars and academics, men who had credentials and respectability in the field of research and scholarship. As a result, Freemasonry becomes an entire field of academic study in Germany. It's kind of ironic that the Germans are trying to kill this group and yet draw people in to study it. It's very interesting. Beginning in the late 1930s and continuing till the war's end, Nazi scholars published papers, attended conferences, held symposia, and held lectures on the history and influence of Freemasonry in Europe and the world. They're coming up with the academic ideas that will then be used as propaganda later on. The RSH Section 7 Research and Analysis held its own conference on the Freemason question in 1942. Knowing this to be the eventual outcome, lodges often hid, shipped out of Europe, or in many cases burned materials. In the latter case, they destroyed documents naming members, typically not furniture and books. And so they had these options. Knowing what's happening as this sort of back line of the Germans pass in on their intellectual crusade and taking out all of the members of groups that they don't allow, they don't accept, the lodges would have a choice. You could bury or hide the material. You could ship it out of Europe, or at least beyond the range of the Nazis. Or in many cases, you burn it. And again, even in that case, it doesn't guarantee that the material won't fall into Nazi hands in the first place, because they can get it from the Grand Lodge or some other group up the line. It becomes a difficult situation. Throughout Germany, they had confiscated this material. That too will end up with the ERR, trying to get at this intellectual war, trying to prove the conspiracy of the Freemasons and the Jews and how they are against the Germans. Proof, by the way, that is never there. Even non-Masonic scholars, and there are a lot of them that kind of deal with this, agree that there is no conspiracy and the Germans never prove anything. But yet they put all of these resources into it. It gets interesting. Why be so concerned about a bunch of old guys sitting around in a room? Why create an entire conspiracy around them and then have the intellectual war? If you know that it's a conspiracy, if you know that you're scapegoating them, why not just scapegoat them and say, hey, those guys, they're bad, attack them? Why go to all this trouble? What is it about Freemasons? So this also brings to mind the Anti-Masonic Exhibitions and propaganda that we see starting in 1940 and 41. As part of their propaganda campaign against Freemasonry, the Nazis and other local right-wing organizations mounted anti-Masonic exhibitions throughout occupied Europe. These displays intended to demonstrate the secrets of Freemasonry. And this is an idea that actually predates the Reich. In 1927, General Erich Ludendorff publishes The Destruction of Freemasonry through the exposure of its secrets. He had been chief of the German Army General Staff during World War I, and although he never joins the party, had participated in the Nazi beer hall Punch in Munich in 1923. It's an attempted coup by Hitler. It fails, he goes to jail, he writes Mein Kampf, you know the rest. In his book, Ludendorff claimed insider knowledge of rituals and beliefs in Freemasonry, and advocated the spreading of such to the general public in order to demonstrate how detrimental to the culture Masons were. As with others, Ludendorff considered the Masons connected with Jews, referring to them as, quote, artificial Jews. The exhibitions made use of confiscated records and objects and were supposedly to show what Masonic lodges look like on the inside. In reality, the displays were distorted views, often with Jewish symbols interspersed with Masonic ones. We might see skeletons and skulls that would appear to no purpose but to play on people's fears. After being confiscated, lodge buildings were opened as a living museum. We see such displays in Berlin, Hanover, Nuremberg, and Dresden, amongst other places. And this is starting in 1937. Kind of an interesting year because it's the same year where we see the rise of the degenerate art shows, where the Nazis will go out and display modern art intentionally poorly, intentionally in bad venues to give you sort of this attachment, this idea that this modern art is bad because of its association with crowded dark rooms and everything else. And that fails miserably because more than 3 times the German public will go to the degenerate art shows as go to the Great German Art Exhibition, which was supposed to show people what good German art looked like. These things don't work out. The idea is there, the execution, perhaps not. Like the degenerate art show, the Masonic Lodge museums were powerful tools of propaganda. They allowed the regime to display genuine Masonic artifacts with the skillful twist of the propaganda ministry, creating a powerful image, one with just enough truth to seem real, but altered just enough to create doubt and serve the aims of the party. If you give someone 90% truth, they'll buy into the 10% lie. And that's what the Germans are doing here. German-occupied Paris will host an anti-Masonic exhibition in October of 1940. We see the same in German-occupied Brussels in February of 1941. Displaying Masonic ritual and cultural artifacts stolen from lodges. Such exhibitions aim to ridicule and direct hatred towards Freemasons and to heighten fears of Jewish Masonic conspiracy, and that conspiracy was easier to sell to the German people who had heard it since World War I than it was to sell to the French, the Belgians, the Netherlands, and other peoples. And so they needed to go one step further. They needed to create these exhibitions, and they needed to add things to them to make them more spectacular, to make you question whether the Masons are really good people or safe or perhaps not. Displaying Masonic ritual and cultural artifacts stolen from lodges, such exhibitions aim to ridicule and direct hatred towards the Freemasons and to heighten fear of that conspiracy. Exhibitions were organized in both Belgium and the Netherlands to lambast and scandalize the fraternity. So we're seeing this throughout Europe. They're trying to sell their propaganda to the Europeans who they have just occupied. The Anti-Masonic exhibit there in Belgium would be visited by approximately 38 to 68,000 people. Numbers that any public museum would love to see. And these are temporary exhibits, open for weeks, occasionally months. Although not in Germany proper, it is interesting to note what the signs and posters advertised at the time. They would say, "Come and see the satanic, ugly mimics and their disgraceful ceremonies performed by this handful of miserables who pretend to save humanity and improve mankind." And remember, it's that unity, that idea of a unified human race, that the Germans are finding so antithetical, so problematic. German wartime propaganda, particularly in the army, charged that the Jews and the Masons had provoked World War II and were responsible for the policies of U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was identified as a Freemason. They also point out that Winston Churchill is a Freemason and fighting against the Germans, and use this as evidence. Hey, look, those guys are Masons and they're fighting against us, so there must be a conspiracy. Ignoring the fact that FDR is in power since 1932. But hey, what the heck? Sometimes propaganda doesn't make sense. When you create the truth, you can create any truth you want, as long as the public doesn't question it. So, what have we covered? We've looked at the amnesty offered to Masons in 1938 and 39 by the Germans because they see the Masons as too important, the people Masons, not the institution. It's too important to the German war effort. You can't have all of those professionals who are held outside of the professions, who are held outside of the army, who can't serve in any capacity. We see the Germans as they spread across Europe, a second wave coming in behind them, sweeping up undesirables, Jews, Freemasons, other groups. They're attacking and grabbing archival material from lodges. They're using that for an intellectual war against Masons and to create these anti-Masonic exhibitions, part of that intellectual war, where 90% is true, 10% is not, but if 90% is true, you're willing to buy that the 10% must be too. Next time, we will explore Masonry in the camps in part 4 of Masonry under the Reich, the Craft Imprisoned.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org. That's wimasons.org. Learn more about Freemasonry and access more educational content and further light. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wimasons.org. Once again, that email address is education@wisconsinmasons.wimasons.org. Thank you for listening.